In the quiet Hungarian village of Nagyrév, the river Tisza flows slowly past rows of modest houses and fertile fields. For nearly 2 decades, between 1911 and 1929, this isolated community held a secret that would eventually horrify the world. While the rest of Europe was torn apart by the Great War and political upheaval, Nagyrév was fighting a silent internal battle. Men were dying at an alarming rate, and the causes of death were always recorded as natural illnesses or sudden heart failure. The local authorities saw no reason to investigate until a series of anonymous notes and a physical discovery forced them to look closer. What they found was a clandestine network of women who had turned their kitchens into laboratories of death. This is the story of the angel makers of Nagyrév. Let's go deep into the well. The origins of the tragedy began with a woman named Julia Fazekas. She arrived in Nagyrév in 1911, a mysterious midwife who quickly became the most influential figure in the village. At a time when medical doctors were scarce and expensive, Fazekas was the functional provider of healthcare for the women of the community. She was a professional who understood the local herbs and the ancient traditions of the region. Her influence went far beyond delivering babies. She became a confidant to many wives who were unhappy, abused, or burdened by the return of disabled soldiers from the front lines of the First World War. Fazekas offered a specific and lethal service to those who felt they had no other escape. She began to distill arsenic from flypaper, creating a colorless and tasteless liquid that could be easily added to a bowl of soup or a glass of wine. She presented this as a functional solution to domestic problems, a way to reclaim freedom without the messy process of divorce or public scandal. The midwife was the architect of a silent uprising that would claim hundreds of lives over the next 18 years. The social structure of Nagyrév during the early 20th century was rigid and traditional. When the men returned from the war, they found a village where women had taken over the labor and the decision-making. The friction between the returning soldiers and their families was intense. Many men were traumatized or physically broken, becoming a perceived burden on the household resources. Julia Fazekas recognized this domestic tension and used it to expand her network. She began to teach other women how to use her arsenic solution. The poisoning was a systematic and professional operation. The women would wait for a quiet evening, prepare a final meal, and watch as their husbands grew ill over several days. Because the symptoms of arsenic poisoning mimicked those of common gastrointestinal diseases, the local priest and the small town officials rarely asked questions. The death was seen as a tragic but natural part of life in a harsh rural environment. This shared secret created a bond of silence among the women of Nagyrév, a clandestine sisterhood that operated under the very nose of the law for nearly 2 decades. As the years passed, the targets of the poisonings expanded beyond just unwanted husbands. The women began to use the arsenic solution to settle inheritance disputes or to remove elderly relatives who required too much care. The functional utility of the poison made it a tool for social engineering within the village. If a family wanted to consolidate land or avoid the cost of a long-term illness, the solution was found in the midwife's flypaper distillation. The number of deaths in Nagyrév and the neighboring village of Tisza began to rise significantly above the national average. The isolation of the region and the lack of a resident doctor meant that death certificates were often signed by a local clerk who was either incompetent or part of the shared silence. The village had become a closed system where the rules of the outside world did not apply. The final meal had become a common method of problem solving, and Julia Fazekas sat at the center of this web, collecting fees and maintaining her professional standing as the most important woman in the community. The first crack in the wall of silence appeared in 1929. A medical student in a nearby town was examining a body pulled from the river and discovered high levels of arsenic in the tissues. Around the same time, anonymous letters began to arrive at the local police station, accusing the women of Nagyrév of mass murder. The authorities were initially skeptical, but the volume of the accusations forced them to launch a professional inquiry. They realized that the death records for the village showed an impossible pattern of sudden respiratory failures among otherwise healthy men. The investigators moved into the village with a level of scrutiny that the community was not prepared for. They began to interview the widows and the local officials, looking for the source of the poison. The atmosphere in Nagyrév shifted from quiet compliance to extreme paranoia. The women knew that their shared secret was being dismantled by an outside force. They tried to hide their supplies of flypaper, but the professional reach of the state was now focused entirely on their kitchens. The investigation required a massive and grisly undertaking, the exhumation of dozens of bodies from the village cemetery. The local community watched in horror as the police began to dig up the graves of men who had been buried years earlier. Because arsenic is a stable element that does not disappear during decomposition, the evidence remained perfectly preserved in the hair and bones of the victims. The forensic team worked day and night, testing the remains of hundreds of individuals. The results were staggering. Nearly every body they tested showed lethal levels of arsenic. This was a mass poisoning of unprecedented scale. The authorities identified over 50 specific cases of murder, though the actual number was estimated to be in the hundreds. The professional coldness of the forensic results provided a functional map of the crimes, pointing directly back to the homes where the final meals had been served. The cemetery had become a library of evidence that documented 18 years of systematic domestic execution. The police eventually focused their attention on the midwife, Julia Fazekas. When they arrived at her house to arrest her, she realized that her professional career as an angel maker was over. She did not wait for a trial. In a final act of control, she took a dose of her own poison and died before she could be interrogated. Her death was a functional victory for the silence she had cultivated. She took many of the specific details of her operations to the grave. The investigation did not stop with her. The authorities arrested dozens of women across the village, charging them with the murder of their husbands, parents, and children. The trials were a sensation in Hungary and across Europe. The public was fascinated by the idea of a village of women who had conspired to eliminate the men in their lives. The courtroom became a stage where the domestic horror of Nagyrév was laid bare for the world to see. The women were forced to confront the professional evidence of their crimes, and the wall of silence finally collapsed into a series of frantic confessions and betrayals. During the trials, the motivations of the women were explored in great detail. Many claimed that they were victims of extreme domestic violence and that the poison was their only functional way to survive. They described a life of brutal labor and abuse at the hands of men who had returned from the war with shattered minds and violent tempers. The prosecution focused on the greed and the calculated nature of the inheritance poisonings. They argued that the women had moved beyond self-defense into a professional pursuit of land and money. The complexity of the case challenged the legal system of the time. The psychological profile of the Nagyrév women showed a unique form of collective detachment, where the act of killing had become a normalized part of village life. They had created their own moral code, one that prioritized the survival of the household unit over the life of the individual. The final meal was not seen as a crime in their eyes, but as a necessary closing of a difficult chapter. The legal consequences for the angel makers were severe. 26 women were brought to trial, and 8 were sentenced to death, though only 2 were eventually executed by hanging. Others received life sentences in prison. The village of Nagyrév was forever changed by the scandal. The social fabric was torn apart as families realized that their neighbors had been poisoners for decades. The men who remained in the village lived in a state of constant fear, wondering if the tradition of the final meal had truly ended with the arrests. The professional oversight of the region was tightened, with new medical regulations and more frequent visits from government doctors. The flypaper industry was forced to change its chemical composition to prevent the easy extraction of arsenic. The tragedy forced the national government to acknowledge the extreme isolation and the lack of social services in rural Hungary, leading to professional reforms in how these communities were governed and supported. Today, the story of Nagyrév is remembered as one of the most chilling cases of mass murder in history. It serves as a reminder of how social isolation and domestic desperation can lead to a breakdown of modern ethics. The angel makers were ordinary women who found a functional but horrific way to navigate a broken world. Their secret was held together by a shared history of struggle and a professional supplier of death in the form of a midwife. The quiet village by the Tisa River still carries the shadow of those 2 decades. The graves in the cemetery remain as a testament to the final meals that were served in the kitchens of Nagyrév. The story is a deep journey into the darker side of human nature, where the line between victim and predator becomes blurred by time and silence. Their story is a record of what happens when a community decides to solve its problems in the shadows of the dinner table. Subscribe, ring the bell, and thanks for watching. Don't forget. I will see you at the bottom of the well.